too. So. No, yeah, if you'll find a seat, we will get started this morning. We are in Philippians chapter 1. Philippians chapter 1. And we're going to be starting in verse 19. Philippians chapter 1 and verse 19. If you'd like to open up there. Looking at sort of the idea of joy, but that joy is really only accessible to the fullest extent that God intends for us to have it through our growth and maturity. And that, that's a hard thing, right? Sometimes maturity is a hard thing to have. But that Philippians is all about that development and that growth and maturity and kind of how we go about trusting in God to receive that. And so he's been sort of building this case throughout the first 18 verses of the book of Philippians of, sometimes there's conflict, sometimes we have problems with one another, sometimes we're irritated with one another, sometimes we hurt one another, sometimes there's just difficulties in the congregation and in life, and that by considering the principles laid out here, we can determine, is the source of conflict really my immaturity, or at least am I adding with my immaturity to the conflict? And if so, what can I do to sort of scale that back and be more mature in order to bring out what really matters? And so starting in verse 19, he says, "For I know that this will turn out for my deliverance through your prayer and supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, according to my earnest expectation and hope, that in nothing I shall be ashamed, but with all boldness as always, so now also Christ will be magnified in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain." And I think really what you get down to here, what he's talking about is core needs. What are some of the core needs that we have in life? What are things that if you didn't have it, you would really just be suffering without?
Love.
Food, clothing.
Health.
Fellowship. Health, yes. Cell phone. TV. Nobody wants to say that?
No technology.
No technology, yeah. Let's get rid of the technology. So, I'm sorry?
Hope.
Hope, yes. And so, really when you think about especially physical life and you're looking at food and clothing and things, and then spiritual life, you have fellowship and hope and those kinds of things. And things that really, if we didn't have them, wouldn't it be difficult to have joy? If we didn't have them, wouldn't it be difficult to feel good about life, to keep your peace and kind of keep moving? And so that's what he's addressing here. But Paul preaches that in essence, really, we only have one core need. In these verses, he is going to give us really what is the one core need that everybody have. And so let's kind of discover that together, starting in verse 19. In verse 19, what do I really need? He says, "For I know that this will turn out for my deliverance." Now, kind of thinking back to the context of what we've looked at, what is he being delivered from? What situation is he in that he needs deliverance from? As he writes this letter, Paul is in a particular location. Prison, yes. He's saying, I know, and you remember back in verse 13, he says, "It's become evident to the whole palace guard that my chains are in Christ," that he is a prisoner, but he's a prisoner because of the gospel that he preaches, because of the work that he's doing for Christ. And so he says, I know that this will turn out for my deliverance. I'm going to be delivered from prison. Now, as we get into it, you'll notice he doesn't say specifically, at least at first, if his deliverance is because they let him out of his chains, or if it's because he's delivered by death. But he considers that deliverance, he's going to be out of prison one way or another. If you're dead, you're not in at least this prison. So he says, I know that this will turn out for my deliverance. And he gives us two things in this verse that are being used to bring about his deliverance. What two things are being used in this verse to bring about his deliverance? Yes, there's the prayer of the saints. And so that's the part that the Christians are playing. They are talking to God about this situation. James says that the prayer of a righteous man avails much. That our prayers do matter, that God does hear them. Just as Moses encouraged God to not start over with him, and God responded to that. When we speak to God on one another's behalf, God really hears that. It reminds me of Acts chapter 12 and verse 12. In Acts chapter 12 and verse 12, that's when Peter was in prison. And the angel came and he let him out of prison. Peter thought it was all a dream until suddenly he was out on the street and he's, this is real. And so he goes to where the Christians are gathered. And do you remember what it says in Acts chapter 12 and verse 12? What were the Christians doing in the house? They were praying for him. Yeah, they prayed for him. He was delivered from prison. That's all Paul said. He says, I know that your prayers will deliver me. And then also he says, through the supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ. And that the word supply is actually a very, very ancient old word that originally was described what you might call like a choir master. What they have these circles of singing and dancing in very ancient times. But you needed someone who was going to, if that was your living, if you sang in these circles for a living, you needed someone who was going to pay for your food and your clothes and buy your trombone and whatever else you were doing, And so they called him the supplier, the one who met all of your needs, who paid for everything that you were doing. And so when he says the supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, he's saying that he knows that God is going to provide whatever he needs to escape from this situation in God's time. God's going to take care of him. God's going to give him what he needs. And part of that comes through the prayer of the saints. And so as he's going through here, notice that talking about deliverance, he's specifically talking about his physical needs. And so it sort of asks the question, the one core need that we all have, is it a physical need? Our one core need, is it a physical need? Is safety and security. Now, he knows that he is going to get out of prison, but currently he's not getting out. Currently he's still there in prison. Currently he is still physically bound. And so the question is, can he have joy even though he's still in prison and physically bound? Can he have the peace that surpasses understanding? And so is it a physical need that is our one core need? As you continue in verse 20, he says, this is according to my earnest expectation and hope that in nothing I shall be ashamed, but with all boldness, as always, so now also Christ will be magnified in my body, whether by life, he doesn't know if he's going to get out of prison by life or by death, but whether by life or death, however it works, Christ will be magnified in his body. And so, again, you kind of come to here, verse 19 was about physical needs. Here he's sort of talking about his emotional state. He doesn't want to be ashamed. Now, what specifically is he afraid of being ashamed of? In verse 20.
And without converting anyone?
To a degree, yes. It sort of the idea of, he says Christ is magnified in my body, and the opposite of that would be if he denied Christ, if he hurt the cause of Christ or diminished the reputation of Christ. And so his concern is not being faithful, of denying Christ in some way, and he would be ashamed of having done that. Now, he's in prison, but his biggest shame is not that he's a prisoner, and I think for a lot of people, especially today in the way that we think of prison, it would be embarrassing, sometimes for some people to say, especially if you didn't feel like you deserved to be there, I was a prisoner or something. But that's not what Paul is concerned about. He's concerned about being ashamed of denying Christ. And so, he has these physical needs, and they're not exactly being met. And he has emotional needs, but our emotional needs, the one core need that we have in life. And it's not to say that the physical and the emotional are unimportant. Robert talked about that a lot last week. They're all connected, aren't they? The spiritual, the physical, emotional. They're all connected. They all play on one another. When you think 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 10, Paul writes there about how he told them, if a man will not work, neither will he eat. And you're supposed to provide for your physical self if you're capable of doing it. Now, clearly, if someone's not capable of working, that's a different story. But if you're capable of providing for your physical self, then you should make the time to do that. Physical needs are important. And you think 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8. In 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8, he says, if a man doesn't provide for his own family, he's worse than an unbeliever. And so, to provide for your family is to work and to make money and to buy food and the things that your family needs. He's not saying that physical needs are unimportant. And same thing with emotional needs. If last week Robert didn't convince you that emotional needs are not important, I just think he really sold that, emotional needs are important. He's not saying that physical and emotional needs are not important, but those are all really byproducts of the one essential need, the one core need that we all have. And I think you could ask the question based on what he says here, is our one core need about continuing to live, just keeping on living, preserving your life in some way. Is that our one core need? How you live it more than the fact that you keep on. Yeah, and really, today I think, I was watching something the other day about a movie that's coming out, and some famous actor, he put himself through some really difficult kind of physical things, all as part of a study to figure out how to help people live longer. And so, he's tormenting himself basically so that people can benefit from what they learn, so that people can have longer lives. And you think that the things that people spend money on, and not that this is necessarily wrong, you should take care of yourself, but the things that people tend to focus on a lot is products and health things or physical things that hide how old you are, or things to make you live longer or look younger. Sometimes life can seem like it's about living as long as you possibly can. But Paul here is saying, verse 21, to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. And so our one core need is not even to preserve our lives at whatever cost. And so notice then, of course, we'll ask the obvious, verse 21, is it a spiritual need? I think we all knew when we started that the answer was going to be, it's a spiritual need. But I think the real question that we're asking is, what is the one core need that verse 21 gives us? What is the one core spiritual need that all other needs kind of flow from? What is the one need that if we have that need met, everything else is good? I'm sorry.
It's not so much the torture.
Sure.
Is being separated from the love of God.
Yes, I think that hits it. And that's, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And that's what, Paul, when you're in prison, you may be separated from all of this, but if you still have the love of God,
right,
it's not to lose that.
Yes, I think that pretty much hits it. Notice verse 21 when he says, to live is Christ. Do you remember math classes when you were young, and if you made an equation, they would say you can take the word, 4 plus 3 is 2, and you can, what? No, sorry. Clearly I wasn't actually doing math, I was just saying numbers, but anyway, 4 plus 3 is 7, right? 4 plus 3 is 7. You can replace the is with equals, right? And that's, you can really do that here. To live equals Christ. That he is Paul's meaning for existence. Every breath that he draws is for Christ. There's not a thing that he does that isn't centered around Christ. But I really like the way that Pat said in particular. He said the problem with hell is not so much the torment and the fire and the worms. Those are really pictures of how miserable a person in hell is more than anything. They are pictures that describe how terrible it feels to have lived this life and realize once you get there, I could have been close to God. And I wasn't. And he called it that separation, the separation from God and from the love of God. The opposite of separation is what the book of Hebrews calls approaching, to draw near to Christ. The one core need that we all have more than anything else is drawing closer and closer. And notice the way he describes it. He says, to live is Christ. To be close to Christ, to be working for Christ, to be doing for Christ, that's life. But what's better than life? To die is gain. You could say profit, increase, surplus, overflow. Dying in his mind is greater because when you die, you get closer to who? You get closer to Christ. And so getting closer to Christ is the one core need that we have. Miss Loretta, were you going to?
Well, that kind of touched on it. I've never really understood that to live is Christ.
Sure.
I get that to die is gain because you get to go to heaven.
Yes.
But to live equals Christ. I guess I understand that.
Yes, we will. And he's going to develop that in the next few verses as exactly what that looks like for him, because it is sort of an abstract concept. And it's true, but it's how is it true is what we need to know. He's going to touch on that. Yes.
Am I right the word is not even in the original language.
No, you are right about that. It's to live.
To live Christ.
Yes.
To die,
Yeah, it's
die.
the reason they put it in there is because it's
Right.
it's implied in the language. They wouldn't have put is like we do, but technically it does say to live Christ. Yeah,
What
yeah.
verse that quote for kids want to quote is short verses. God is love.
Yes.
If we did not have God, we wouldn't know what love is.
Right.
And we would just be like we have.
Like any animal, it's what makes us unique among creation. Yes.
Well, today's game, that's, of course, that's what we're all looking for, but as long as he's alive and living like he does, he can still.
Yes. Yes. And that, I think, go
What
ahead.
he means by living is.
Mhm. That really, he's going to get into kind of back, he's going to get into that idea. Miss Faye really going to hit on what he's going to say living is about. What does it mean to live is Christ? And so, it's a spiritual need. It's drawing near to Christ. You think Philippians chapter 4, verses 11 through 12. If you want to skip ahead a little bit, Philippians chapter 4, verse 11 and 12, he addresses the physical. He says, "Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased or to have nothing, and I know how to abound, how to have, way too much to be wealthy. Everywhere and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry." And he means literally, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And so he says, if drawing close to Christ is your one primary need, and you are drawing closer to him, then even if your physical needs are not met, you're okay with that because your one most important need is being met. Same thing with verse 6. In verse 6, he describes our emotional satisfaction. He says, be anxious for nothing. What that implies is there's a reason why most people would be anxious. There's something going on that would make a person anxious. But he says, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. And so it's not that the emotions don't matter. They certainly do. But if we are drawing closer to Christ, we more and more will find that even when we find ourselves in anxious situations, we are satisfied and fulfilled. We have that peace that surpasses understanding because we're focused on the one core need. And all right, let's continue then and look at verse 22. Verse 22. Where he says, but if I live on in the flesh, this will mean fruit from my labor. Yet what I shall choose, I cannot tell. Now he says choose there. You could translate that word prefer, and I think that would be a clearer translation. He's not saying that he's going to decide if he dies or lives. That's God's, that's the choice that God allows. He's not saying that he's certainly not saying anything about taking his life or anything like that. He's saying, I don't know what I prefer, to live is Christ, to die is gain. Those are both good things. Obviously, gain is better, but there is good in the living. Now, what specifically he says live? What does he tie living to in verse 22? Sure, yeah, living on in the flesh, and then I guess yes, labor thing. What I mean, let me clarify my question because I can see where that's confusing. He ties living to a certain activity.
Evangelize.
I'm sorry.
Evangelize.
Yeah, evangelizing, or the labor specifically, whatever kind of labor a Christian would do for Christ. He says to live means fruit from my labor. To live means to bear fruit. To live means to be doing the cause of Christ with every breath that you breathe. And so I think kind of what we can take from verse 22 is, what if I'm alive, but my situation is so bad that I wish that I wasn't alive? And, that doesn't necessarily have to mean that a person is thinking about taking their life. You can wish that you weren't alive and not be, to that point. You just wish it were true. You feel so full of whatever is happening, so much regret or so much grief, so much pain, whatever it is, that Jonah says, take my life, God. He's just so distressed that he's not thinking of taking his own life, but he does say, please take it from me. And you see that throughout in the Psalms. Job says, I wish I had never even been born in the first place. To wish that you weren't alive is not a wrong thing in and of itself.
I can think about the today's equivalent, I think, would be someone's human trafficking.
Sure,
The
yeah.
situations they're in has just got to be terrible.
Yes, you think of a very extreme example, that would be, but really I think probably many of us have felt that way just based on, especially the emotions that we feel sometimes. I know that I have, and I know that I'm not alone in that sometimes our emotions are so big, or as John, our circumstances, even if they're not necessarily that extreme, although certainly I think that would do it, can make us feel that way. What if I'm alive, but I don't really want to anymore? And that's what Paul is almost saying. He says, I don't know what I prefer. Part of me really feels like I wish that I weren't alive anymore, that I could to die is gain. Yes, Miss Faye.
You know, sometimes people are in a lot of pain or whatever, and the thing is that I think back to my mom. She wanted to go and be with the Lord.
Sure.
And she had lived the life that she felt like she knew that was going to happen.
Yes.
I don't want to be here anymore.
Right.
You know, and I don't think there's anything wrong with it. She's just
Ready to go. Yes, certainly there are circumstances where that's the natural reaction, I think. And so the question then, what does Paul say if we get to a point, and especially if, I think verse 23 is going to deal more specifically with if you're limited and near death and you can't, physically you can't do a lot, but especially if you're still technically physically able, if you're still technically capable of carrying conversation or moving or whatever it may be, but you don't feel like you want to be alive anymore. What is it that brings Paul back to that place of contentment? What is it that brings him back to that place of mature moving forward in verse 22?
Because he gives him peace.
What brings him peace in verse 22? The fruit from his labor. There's still something I can do. There's still some way that God can use me. There's still some way that the actions that I take today, maybe a seed planted or a seed watered, that's going to produce fruit in somebody at some point, that's going to encourage a brother or sister who someday may be tempted to fall away, that's going to help people get back up and keep moving forward. There's something, big or small, that I can do today, and that is what living is. I think Don called it evangelism. You could really, any good work that you can find, sometimes that sort of seems like the back burner stuff. It's the stuff we're trying to find space for in our life. It's the stuff that we're trying to fit in. And Paul says, that's not the back burner stuff. That is life. Everything else is the back burner stuff. The job and all of those things, while we do have to do them every day in priority, and therefore when we see the opportunity to do any good work, those things are back burner. To live is to do Christ's purpose. Linda, yes, ma'am.
Well, that's what I'm thinking. Even like you said, we all have felt that way.
Sure.
But then I have remembered from those people counting on me.
Yes. Yes.
I'm better served to stay alive in this world and not feel, I want to go on to heaven.
Go on. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and we should long for heaven, certainly. That's a healthy thing. But that's exactly what Paul says. He says, if you continue, we'll skip ahead a little bit, and he says in verse 24, nevertheless, to remain in the flesh is more needful for you. They needed Paul. That was an honorable thing. That's a valuable thing. And so even when being in prison really brought him low, he said, I can see how, he says back in verse 13, look how it's affecting people in prison, in the palace guards right now. Now, it's not as much work as he could do outside of prison, but it's still an important work. Those souls are still valuable souls. But then he says in verse 19, he says, I know that I'll be delivered out of this because I can see that you still need me. I can see that there's still work that I can do, even greater, even more work than what I'm currently doing once I get out. I can live for that. Yes?
Sometimes it's difficult for us to look at ourselves and realize that there is a need for you to be here.
Sure.
It's such as grandparents. Grandparents feel wonderful with
Oh, yeah.
opportunity
Yes.
to assist the children
Mm-hmm.
and even their own children, giving them strength to stay with their children.
Right.
To wring their necks.
Yeah, yeah. No, it is. It's
And there's so many things that we can do to help people who are in need in situations like that. And
Mhm.
really, we don't often see that there are so many needs for us. And can be doing.
I think that's it. I think our culture teaches everybody really to marginalize yourself in your mind and to really emphasize what you can't do. Paul is in a sense marginalized. He's the apostle of the Gentiles who can't go out and preach to the Gentiles. He's stuck in prison. But he doesn't, and maybe that was a temptation, but notice how he doesn't marginalize himself and say, what can I not do anymore? He says, what can I still do? What am I capable of today? What do I see as potential in the future that I'm hoping for? And that gives new life into him, where when you marginalize yourself and focus on what you can't do anymore, that only leads to being down. Yeah.
I think that's a good deal of what's leading so many people toward depression and
Sure.
suicide and things that's going on right now. I think like people that come back from the military, they no longer see a need for themselves.
Right.
They don't know what to do.
I think that's a really good point. That a change in role doesn't mean a less important role. Just, and just using the military as an example, just because you at one time were a soldier and now you're a civilian and you have a different role doesn't mean it's a less valuable role. And that's true in the church too. Whatever you used to do that you had to let go because of limitations or just changes, or, Paul has these new limitations and changes, whatever it is, it doesn't mean it's a less valuable role. 1 Corinthians 12 says every single part of the body, from the most obvious parts to, the liver that nobody can see, but that just chugs along and does its work, they're all essential. And without one of them, the body would not be the same. It would be hurt. Yes?
Well, the other thing is, we can, especially when you get old like me, you can maybe help people not make the mistakes that you made, because I'm 80 years old and I've got 80 years worth of mistakes.
Sure.
And somebody else only has 30, so hey, I got it on them.
Yep. That's, you think, Second Titus 2, it says, I'm second. Y'all. Titus 2 is, the older men are to instruct the younger men. The older women are to instruct the younger women. There is great value, and even when physically limited, in an example of being able to just sit in your house with a group of people and talk about the Bible together, being able to instruct people. Physical limitations, certainly, according to Paul, are no real limitation when it comes to the gospel. So then, as he continues then into verse 23, he says, I am hard-pressed between the two. This choice, what he prefers, would he rather die or would he rather keep living? I am hard-pressed between the two. He says, having a desire to depart and to be with Christ. Now, is Christ with him in life? Yes. You think Matthew 28, the very last verse, Christ says, Lo, I am with you always. Christ is with us in this life. But isn't it true that in a sense, it's more with him in the next life? You go on to the spiritual realm where you're not bound by the physical anymore, just as he isn't anymore. And so you're more with him there. He says, I want to go be even closer to Christ, to draw even nearer to Christ. That's far better, verse 23. And so, kind of on the other side, what if I am near death, or even if I'm younger, but I'm limited, and, you could kind of put it as good as dead. Sometimes you're not near death, but you can't do nearly as much as you used to. And so it feels like you're as good as dead because you're not as useful in your mind as you used to be. What if I'm limited, or what if I'm really near death, but I'm not ready for that? I'm not ready to be limited in these ways. I'm not ready to be so close to death. What if that is my case? He says being near to death is nearer to Christ. It's to what Hebrews 4:10 calls your rest, and that's, if to live as Christ means to labor and bear fruit, then to die as gain means to not have to labor anymore and to rest. Notice what Hebrews 4:10 says. Hebrews 4:10. Sometimes I try to paraphrase Bible verses, and then I think, it'll be better if we just read it out loud. So Hebrews 4:10 says, For he who has entered his rest has himself also ceased from his work as God did from his. Going back to day 7 of creation. That to die is to be free from the burdens of this life and to just rest in the place that God made for us. And so we're being brought closer to that, closer to being done bearing fruit. And so then death brings me even closer to Christ. And, it brings us closer to understanding what Christ went through himself, which of course helps us understand Christ better, which of course helps us to identify with him more, and helps us to know Him better. Don.
We all have different talents. We can all work for the Lord in different ways.
Different ways, yes.
But just like the song we sang about stand up for Jesus.
Yes.
You know, when you're at the end of that battle, you know, hey, look, my mom,
Yeah.
you know, you're close to that victory song.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
You can teach people even in death. I know I've watched my mother. I was fortunate to be with my mom and dad both when they died.
Sure.
They taught me how to
Yeah.
in that last little bit.
It is.
You think, what do they have to offer? They taught me how to die.
There is such great value in that. There really is. And death, Hebrews 2 says that the two things that terrify man, the two problems, our greatest problems, are sin and death. And the struggles that we have all come back to our temptations to sin and our terror of dying. And, certainly, if we have Christ, we have what we need to die right. But there is great value in being with people and learning those experiences and seeing for yourself what that looks like when a faithful Christian goes home. And I think that's very true. And so, anything that brings us closer to death in a way can, if we'll let it, bring us closer to Christ. And if we think of our limitations or our age or whatever it may, if we think of it that way. I once heard someone say, 1 Corinthians says the body is a seed. Paul says the seed must crack and die if anything is going to grow out of it. I think of it, sometimes we talk about our body's aging. I know you all look at me and you think I'm so young, but I have aches and pains too, y'all. I really do. So, no, but you think about your body's aging, and I heard someone say it once. It's just another little crack that gets me closer to blooming. To growing, to sprouting. That's the word, to sprouting, and that's there. It's hard, and it's difficult, but there's great value in growing closer to Christ through that. All right, we don't have long, so the last little bit here, verses 24 and 25. It says, nevertheless, to remain in the flesh is needful for you, and being confident of this, I know that I shall remain and continue with you all. Now, how probably does Paul know this for certain? He has access to the Holy Spirit. Yeah, the supply of the Spirit. Yeah, and so I think God has told him he's going to, if we were in prison and we were writing to someone, we couldn't say with such confidence, I know I'll get out of here. But I think Paul is inspired here. He says, I know that I shall remain in this life. I know I will continue with you all because you need progress. You need the joy of faith. You need to rejoice for me, that your rejoicing for me may be more abundant in Jesus Christ by my coming to you again. Verse 26. And so in this moment of, does Paul die in prison? Is he executed by the emperor? Or does Paul continue to live? He says, God tells me I'm going to continue to live this time around because the greater need is here. My work is not done. Now, just a few years later, he was imprisoned again, and you read 1 and 2 Timothy, and you read about that time that he was in prison a second time. And he says at the end of 2 Timothy, he says, I am being poured out like a drink offering. I have run the race. I have fought the good fight. And I know, and there, he did not survive. He was executed by the emperor at that time. His I don't know, was it third, fourth time in prison or whatever it is, ended with his death. And so Paul didn't always get out of prison death-free, but he would have said the same thing there. To live is Christ. To die is gain. And so bearing fruit for Christ benefits me. You notice how he describes that in 21 and 22. He's encouraged by the own fruit that he sees from his labors. Bearing fruit for Christ benefited the Philippians. It benefits other peoples. And that's what he talks about in 24 to 26. It brings them progress and joy. It brings them rejoicing. It brings increased faith. But bearing fruit for Christ, most importantly, benefits Christ Jesus. Remember chapter 1 and verse 11. Chapter 1 and verse 11, he says, being filled with the fruits of righteousness. And same idea, that this labor that fills with the fruits of righteousness, which are by Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God. And I think sometimes our difficulties, if we keep in mind that God will work these things out for good, for his glory and his praise, Romans chapter 8:28, it's a lot easier to just get through those and be patient through those, to wait on the Lord. Remember the big purpose of all of these things. And so Paul's physical needs, they're not entirely met at this time. Paul's emotional needs, he doesn't say if they're met or not, but they could not be, and they are important. And they are a part of who he is. But when you reach that level of maturity of being able to just see clearly my one need is drawing closer to Christ, and if I have that, then Christ in the desert for 40 days fasting. That's a long time to fast. I never fasted 40 days of you. How is he able to be faithful at the end of 40 days when he's so hungry and Satan says, well, you could just turn that into bread and eat it right now? How is he able to overcome that temptation? Because fasting and being out there and enduring that was how he was drawing closer to God. That was satisfying. Remember what he told the apostles after he spoke to the woman at the well and they said, would you like some food? He said, I have food you know not of. I can be satisfied when I'm physically hungry. I can be satisfied although my pillow is a rock. I can be satisfied when there's chaos and stress all around me, and we, by all standards, should just, panic with anxiety. I can be satisfied if my focus is on drawing closer to Christ and seeing how these troubles are helping me do that. And so, what really matters, again, as we close, this all comes back to conflict. That's what he's building up toward, chapter 4, verse 2, Yodi and Syntyche. He's all talking about conflict. In conflict, what really matters. Chapter 4 and verse 10 says, approve the things that are excellent. And to pick out in any situation what's really important here, what really matters. If my conflict is not about something that keeps me from drawing closer to Christ or keeps you from drawing closer to Christ, it's something that I can let go. It doesn't mean it's not important, but it's not as important as that one need. It's not worth continuing conflict over something that isn't keeping us from drawing closer to Christ. Now, if it's about doctrinal matters, if it's about something that's going to keep us from drawing closer to Christ, that's something worth continuing the conflict for. But that's why Jude says contend, conflict for the faith. But anything else, if I'm adding immaturity to conflict about something that doesn't keep me from drawing closer to Christ or doesn't keep you from drawing closer to Christ, I'm adding immaturity for something that in eternity I will not even remember anymore. And that is a standard by which we should judge what is worth having conflict over and what is not worth having conflict over. Any other thoughts or comments as we close?
I was reading in either Proverbs or Psalms yesterday.
Yes,
and
ma'am.
I can't remember where it was found, but it just struck me because it said, when you're saying all these beauty products or whatever you do add to make your life longer or prettier or whatever, it said that whatever you've done, you would, at one point in your life before you die, you will lose your strength, you will lose your health, because you are going to die.
Sure. Yeah. It's guaranteed unless Jesus comes back first. And so, we don't know when that is. Potentially we could all die someday, and that seems like the likely reality. And so, yes, ma'am. And that's I'm glad you're reading the Psalms and Proverbs. They really are quite amazing, aren't they? So, yeah. Any other thoughts or comments? All right. Well, we will close there. And as I said, next week Sarah and I will go to town. We're going to go visit her parents and her grandma. And then the week after that, Heath Stapleton will be here giving us a report. So we'll pick up Philippians in, I guess, 3 Sundays from now. So we got lots of time to read the next section.